Where was God? Where was God when I was arrested? I was just serving him. And he's all-powerful. Certainly he could have stopped me from being arrested. Why did he let that happen? When I was tortured, why did God allow that to happen to me? When people were burning cigarettes on my body, what was God doing? And Pastor, where were you? You live across the other side of the world in America, yet you preach to us here and expect us to go out and pay the price and be arrested and tortured. Where were you? Were you doing anything for me when I was being tortured? These questions were running through Pastor Homoz's mind as he was anticipating a phone call that he was about to receive. They weren't his questions. They were the questions he anticipated he might be hearing from the young man on the other end of the line. A young man who, because he followed the call and the invitation of Pastor Homoz, had become a leader of 3 illegal house churches in Iran, and then had been arrested and tortured because of his faithfulness to the call of Jesus. And now, having been released, he had sent a message to Pastor Homoz, who lived in the United States on the other side of the world, but was his pastor for all intents and purposes, because there aren't pastors really to speak of in Iran. And Pastor Homoz ran a ministry, still runs a ministry today, that broadcasts Christian television via satellite into Iran 24 hours a day. And so this young man viewed Pastor Homoz as his pastor. And when he was released from prison, he sent a message back through the network to Pastor Homoz saying, I want to talk to you. And Pastor Homoz is now thinking in his mind, I wonder what he's going to say. And he was trying to prepare himself mentally for the questions that he thought he might be asked. But before I tell you how their conversation actually went, let me back up and just give you a little bit of background. First, about Pastor Homoz. He was born to an Islamic Iranian family, but emigrated to the United States with his family as a young man. He became a Christian here in the United States while he was a graduate student, studying computer science, I believe. And he dedicated his life then to reaching the people of Iran with the gospel, motivated largely by what happened to his younger brother, who at 16 years of age was arrested by the government of Iran for some minor charge, languished for 2 whole years in prison without a trial, and then was ultimately sentenced and condemned and killed by firing squad. And Pastor Homoz says, God revealed to me that the best way I could respond to this tragedy was to try to win as many people in Iran to Jesus as possible. And so he's dedicated his life to this now. I heard this story on a Voice of the Martyrs radio interview that first aired back in October 2015. And I should probably also give just a refresher for those of you who are not keeping up on the state of affairs in Iran. Most of us know where Iran is now because of the Iran-Iraq conflict. Many of you may also know that it's a majority Shiite Muslim country, and that its rule, it's a church-state government, right? So it's in the government of Iran is Islamic. The religion is not separate from the state. And that began in 1979 with an Islamic revolution that overturned the previous government and set up this state-run religion as the government. The man who came to power in 1979, many of you will have heard of, his name was Ayatollah Khomeini. At least that's how most of us in the West speak of him. And many people say that the Ayatollah has been the single greatest Christian evangelist in the history of Iran. Because of the repressive policies of his government, the injustice, the mistreatment of people, the people of Iran have become more and more disenchanted with, initially, with the government of Iran. The initial response in the first decades was, well, we're excited to become an Islamic, church-state country. They were expecting that we'll be able to set up paradise on earth. But when they discovered what life was really like under Sharia law and under the religious rule, they became quickly disenchanted with the whole enterprise. But their first reaction was to say, well, the problem is not with Islam. The problem is with the government and how they're implementing Islam. And so there was a period of time where people were just upset with the government, but still very much committed to the religion. But one of the things that this caused was many people who had been sort of nominally Muslim, but not really investigated the faith for themselves, now went back and really began to investigate what's in the Quran. What is it behind these people who are running our government and being so harsh in the way they rule? Are they at odds with what the religion teaches? And could we have a better system based on Islam? And increasingly, in the next decades, people who went back and investigated discovered that what was going on in the government was not actually out of harmony with the content of the Quran and the example of the Prophet. And so what happened was, under this harsh regime, that generation then became disenchanted not just with the government, but with Islam as well. And many of them rejected Islam wholesale. But they're left with a spiritual void because the government is still Islamic. Other religions are not allowed. Conversion to another religion is not allowed. Missionaries aren't allowed. And so there's a whole generation that have become secular, skeptical, maybe even atheistic. And then they have raised their children with no religious or faith guidance whatsoever. And these young people now have grown up with no purpose in their life, no real reason to live. Many of them have turned to sex and drugs and alcohol to try to find something worthwhile to do with themselves. And after, 5 or 6 years of that, they start at 13 or 14, and by the time they're 19 or 20, they discovered that the pursuit of pleasure is completely empty. And many of them turn to suicide because they have no hope. But ministries like the ministry of Pastor Hormoz, beaming the gospel message into Iran, are being heard. And the government, while making Christianity illegal and persecuting people who may turn to it, has not been able to stop a wave of conversions to Christianity through the ministry of people outside the country sending messages in. In Iran, they do everything they can to control the inflow of information, right? So you can read the state newspapers and watch state media, but you're not allowed to have a satellite dish. You're not. They block Facebook. You're not supposed to be on social media. Although interestingly, any guess what the number one used website in Iran is today? No? I just said it. Facebook. Because people figure out, using proxies and other means, how to get around the government's firewall and still get on social media. So people are getting a taste of the outside world, but generally things are, it's made difficult by the government. It's very hard to get access. And so even though satellites are outlawed because they don't want their citizens watching messages and news and other things coming from the outside world, nearly everyone in the country has one. And there are photos of rooftops in Iran where every square inch of the roof is covered with satellite dishes. I mean, the civil disobedience, if you want to call it that, is so widespread that it's a losing battle. The government, they'll use it when they're after somebody, I suppose, but they have been unable to actually stop it. And because people are so hungry for voices from the outside world, to get news and information from elsewhere, television is a huge part of their lives. People will save up their money for months and months and months to be able to buy a TV and get a satellite dish so they can get these messages. And so it's very natural for them in that context to be curious and interested, even in the messages of Christianity that they can view over television. And because of Christian ministries like the one run by Pastor Hormoz, many people have turned to Jesus. Some of them, particularly the older generation, those that have kids and families and maybe work or career established already in their lives, many of them are very careful, and they are unwilling to risk getting themselves in more trouble or arrested by contacting the ministries that are sending these messages into Iran. And so if they reach out, they'll do so secretly or just once or twice. They don't make phone calls, or they will connect and say, we're here, but I'm not going to be able to contact you again because I don't want to get caught. But many of the younger people, particularly these young people who have tried pleasure seeking and found that it was empty and who are ready to end their lives, these young people, when they turn to Jesus, many of them are very, very bold. And they will call up the ministry, and the people answering phones at the ministry say, "Don't call us from your home phone. The government is listening. You'll get caught. You'll get in trouble." And the young people say, "Don't worry about me." And they say, "Well, why? Why aren't you afraid?" He said, "Look, I was dead. I was already dead. What could the government do to me? Jesus has given me new life. If I'm not faithful to him, I'm dead again. What can they do? It's not me who's afraid of the government. It's the government that's afraid of me. They're afraid of the power of the gospel, and that's why they jail us and lock us up. So don't worry about me." Amazing. So this young man that I told you about, I don't even know his name. Pastor Hormoz telling the story obviously wouldn't tell us his name. He was arrested and tortured. But he had some health problems. And after a few days of being arrested, the authorities released him to get some treatment. So they actually let him go to the hospital, with the understanding that after his treatment, he was going to have to come back and serve the rest of his sentence. So when he's out, knowing that he may only be out for a few days or weeks, he sends a message through to Pastor Hormoz saying, "Pastor, I want to talk to you." And there is Pastor Hormoz sitting in his house in Texas, thinking, what is he going to ask me? Trying to prepare himself mentally. How am I going to answer these questions? Potentially very tough questions. How do I defend God's inaction? And what if he accuses me of not being there for him? Here I got him into this mess. But when he answered the phone, the young man completely surprised him. He had such a gentle spirit, and he said, Pastor, I had the honor of being tortured for Jesus." He used that word, honor. And Pastor Hormoz said, "What? Tell me more." So the young man related his experience of being in jail and how real the presence of Jesus was to him. He wasn't asking where was Jesus because he met Jesus there. Jesus was with him and he knew it. And then he said, Pastor, you know that verse in the 23rd Psalm? Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. How is anyone supposed to experience that verse unless your enemies are there? He said, I lived that verse there in the presence of my torturers. Jesus was with me. So Pastor Hormoz said, young man, I thought I was going to be trying to comfort you. But you have changed my life forever. I will never be the same. Do you live with such a hunger for the presence of Jesus that he eclipses everything that the devil or your enemies or your friends might do to you? I have to admit, most of the time I don't. I allow the troubles and struggles and insults of life to get under my skin. But this story moved me to keep looking to Jesus. Let me just show you this picture. This is just for a metaphor here. Anybody know what this is? It is, and we just recently had a special eclipse, and this is a photo of it, actually, from NASA, of this recent eclipse. And what was especially fun about this eclipse is not depicted in this picture. It was called a ring of fire eclipse. And this, I don't think, is this one that we just had here. But a ring of fire eclipse is one where the moon is at a particularly far point in its orbit around the Earth. And so when it passes in front of the sun, normally an eclipse, a total eclipse, blocks out the sun, and you see kind of some light around it, but it makes everything totally dark, and you don't actually see any of the disk of the sun. But a ring of fire eclipse actually leaves a little bit of the sun still visible. But I saw this when I was thinking about this story, how this young man's vision of Jesus, looking at Jesus, eclipsed everything else that was happening, right? Jesus was bigger in the room than his torturers. And I went just sort of looking for pictures of eclipses because, I thought this is a useful metaphor to think about this. But then when I saw it, it reminded me of something else. Now, this is not meant to be an eclipse. This is a pretty universal symbol of Islam. It's on the Turkish flag. It was adopted, centuries ago and used by many Islamic entities. But I saw that and I thought, wow, that's fascinating. It's meant to be a crescent moon. It's not an eclipse. It's not the sun being blocked by the moon. But it just made me think, what an interesting metaphor, comparison here, right? That when I look at this now, I'm no longer going to see just a crescent moon. It's going to remind me of this eclipse and of my hope and my prayer, right? Having the presence of Jesus with you does not make the trouble go away. It doesn't put out the fire. It doesn't stop the heat that may be coming on your life, whether it's trial or trouble or sickness, death. But Jesus can eclipse anything that the enemy or this world throws at you. Because only Jesus brings life out of death. And I wonder also if perhaps what we see happening in Iran is that Jesus is eclipsing another view of God. and bringing peace to people who have found only emptiness. My hope is that when you see an eclipse or maybe even a crescent moon, you'll remember this story of this young man and be encouraged to turn your eyes upon Jesus and to pray that your vision of him will be so clear that nothing else that may happen to you will destroy your peace. The last year and a half has been difficult for us all. So this was my title today. Now you know why the title. Sometimes it seems like it would have been easier to be a Christian all by myself. But I am so grateful after hearing, I didn't go into this part, so one more detail. In Iran now, the persecution that people undergo is typically not from their families. When people turn to Christianity, a lot of what you hear about in the Middle East and in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or other Muslim countries, if somebody becomes a Christian, they have to flee the country because their own family members will turn on them, harm them, disown them, kick them out of the family, make sure that they can never get a job again. All these kinds of things happen from the community of people who actually know the person. But in Iran, because so many people have thrown out Islam entirely, if you become a Christian, chances are your family doesn't care. They're not going to bother you. They're not going to hassle you. So all of the persecution comes from the government. And really, it's not that the government cares that much about whether you're a Muslim or a Christian. For religious reasons, it's that the government is afraid if a large number of people become Christians in Iran, that as a political organization, that politically they're in danger. And so they're mad about people becoming Christians, not really for religious reasons, but for political reasons. And so the persecution, even, it's strange, but they have enough experience with Christians now that when people are arrested, the authorities do not plead with them or beg them or threaten them or try to convince them to come back to Islam. They will openly say to them, we've met enough of you Christians now. We know you're not coming back. So what they do is they torture them to try to find out information. Who are your contacts? Who shared the gospel with you? Because they want to be able to keep track of the other Christians. And they threaten them with more severe punishment if they share their faith with anyone, if they make contact with Christians from the outside world, if they attend a house church. They will torture them to get them to sign documents saying, if I do any of these things, you can rearrest me and double my sentence. And with those kinds of assurances, then they release people because they can't jail them all. And that's the kind of persecution that they undergo. Well, we've had a small taste of some isolation in this last year, but we could be on Zoom and Facebook and phone calls, and we weren't really suffering. And we have the privilege of openly interacting and encouraging each other and building each other up in our faith. Our government is not trying to prevent us from knowing another Christian. So we're incredibly blessed. Incredibly blessed. This story has reminded me also of the privilege that I have of being with you all around the Lord's table, and of the solidarity that we have with Christians all over the world who are our brothers and sisters in faith, even the ones that we've never met. When Jesus was arrested and tortured for me, he didn't utter a word of complaint. He didn't say, Peter, how come you didn't stick up for me? He went quietly and bravely And I want to have the same attitude that Jesus had. Therefore, we also, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Philippians 1:29, for to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. As you go and wash feet and return then here to the Lord's table, pray for yourselves that you will see Jesus clearly in the experience that we are sharing here together.